The whiskey burned, but not as much as the silence. Elena Martinez gripped her glass at Rusty's bar, watching amber liquid swirl like liquid gold she couldn't buy her way out of this emptiness with. The engagement ring felt heavy in her pocket, 2 carats of everything she didn't want. Across the smoky room, a man sat alone, his calloused hands telling stories of real work, real struggle. His eyes held the same hollow ache she recognized in her mirror every morning. When he glanced up, their gazes locked for 3 heartbeats. No words, just understanding. 2 strangers drowning in different oceans, recognizing the same shipwreck. As he stood to leave, Elena surprised herself by speaking. "Same time tomorrow?" Her voice barely cut through the bar's hum. He paused, turned back with something that might have been hope flickering in his tired eyes. A small nod, nothing more, but as the door closed behind him, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. 24 hours felt like forever. Elena sat in the same corner booth at Rusty's, her fingers drumming against the wooden table, worn smooth by countless conversations and spilled dreams. The bartender knew her order now, whiskey neat, untouched for most of the night. She checked her watch for the 15th time. 9:37. He was 7 minutes late, but who was counting? Her. Every second stretched like elastic, threatening to snap. The bar filled with its usual crowd, construction workers washing away the day's dust, office clerks drowning Monday blues, couples stealing moments between responsibilities. But no sign of him. At 10:15, she finally accepted what her heart had been whispering all along. He wasn't coming. Maybe their moment had been just that. A moment, beautiful and brief as a match struck in darkness. She drove home through empty streets, her car's engine the only sound breaking the suburban silence. But even as disappointment settled in her chest like lead, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. For the first time in months, she'd reached for connection instead of control. For the first time in years, she'd spoken to a stranger not because she needed something from them, but because she simply wanted to. The memory of his tired eyes and gentle nod stayed with her as she pulled into her empty garage, as she climbed the stairs to her empty bedroom, as she lay staring at the ceiling of her empty life. Tomorrow would bring another day of board meetings and corporate decisions, but tonight had planted a seed of something different, something real, something worth watering, even if she didn't know how. 3 days later, Elena's perfectly planned world cracked like ice under pressure. Her car, a sleek black sedan that cost more than most people's annual salary, chose the worst possible moment to betray her. Steam poured from under the hood as she pulled into the first garage she could find, a modest shop squeezed between a laundromat and a diner in a neighborhood she'd never visited. The sign read, "Mitchell's Auto Repair," in faded blue letters, and the building looked like it had weathered a few storms but remained standing through stubborn determination. Elena stepped out of her car, her designer heels clicking against oil-stained concrete, feeling as out of place as a diamond in a toolbox. The mechanical sounds from the bay ahead mixed with classic rock playing from an old radio, creating a symphony of honest work that felt foreign yet strangely comforting. "Engine trouble?" The voice made her freeze. She turned slowly, and there he was, the man from the bar, emerging from beneath the hood of an old pickup truck, a wrench in his hand and recognition dawning in his eyes. "I know you." His voice carried surprise, maybe a hint of embarrassment. "From Rusty's." Elena felt her carefully constructed composure slip for just a moment. Here, in his element, surrounded by tools and machinery, he looked different, confident, capable. The fluorescent lights caught the silver in his dark hair, and she noticed details she'd missed in the bar's dim atmosphere. The way his shoulders filled out his work shirt, the careful precision with which he set down his tools, the small smile that softened the edges of his weathered face. "I'm Jake," he said, extending a hand stained with honest work. "Jake Mitchell." Elena took his hand, feeling the calluses she'd noticed that first night, understanding now that they told the story of a man who built things, fixed things, made things whole again. The afternoon stretched longer than either had planned. What should have been a simple radiator repair became something more complicated. Not the car, but the conversation that wound around the mechanical work like ivy around a fence post. Jake worked with careful precision, while Elena found herself genuinely curious about engines for the first time in her life. Used to design these, he mentioned casually, his hands deep in the car's mechanical heart. Before. He didn't elaborate on before, and Elena didn't push. She understood about befores, the parts of your life that existed in shadows, too painful or too precious to examine in direct light. Instead, she watched him work, noting the way he treated her expensive car with the same respect he'd shown the battered pickup. No judgment about the luxury, no resentment about the disparity. Just honest work, fairly done. By the time the sun began its descent, Jake had fixed more than her radiator. He'd somehow cracked open a space in Elena's day where time moved differently, where conversation happened in comfortable pauses between the clink of tools and the hum of machinery. When he finally lowered the hood and wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better years, Elena realized she wasn't ready for this accidental afternoon to end. "It's getting late," Jake said, glancing toward the small apartment above the garage, where warm light glowed in the windows. "My daughter will be wondering where I am." He paused, studying Elena's face. "Would you like to stay for dinner? Nothing fancy, but Emma makes a mean grilled cheese, and I promise the company's better than anything you'll find at the country club." The invitation hung between them like a bridge neither had planned to build, but both suddenly wanted to cross. Dinner was a revelation wrapped in simplicity. Emma Mitchell, 8 years old, with her father's eyes and a smile that could light up rooms, treated Elena like an interesting puzzle to solve, rather than an intimidating stranger. The apartment above the garage was small but warm, filled with the kind of love that money couldn't buy and architects couldn't design. Hand-drawn pictures covered the refrigerator. Homework assignments were scattered across a kitchen table that had witnessed countless meals and conversations, and everywhere Elena looked she saw evidence of a life built from scratch, with careful hands and fierce devotion. "Dad, she talks fancy," Emma announced, with the brutal honesty only children possess, causing Jake to flush red and Elena to laugh. Really laugh, for the first time in months. "I suppose I do," Elena admitted, sitting cross-legged on the floor, as Emma showed her a book about dolphins, explaining in serious tones why they were clearly the most intelligent creatures on Earth. As the evening deepened, Elena found herself washing dishes alongside Jake while Emma practiced piano in the next room, a small upright instrument that had seen better decades, but still carried melodies with sweet determination. The domestic rhythm felt foreign, yet natural, like speaking a language she'd forgotten she knew. "Her mother played," Jake said quietly, his hands stilling in the soapy water. "Cancer took her 2 years ago. Had to choose between keeping my engineering job and being here for Emma." He didn't say it like he regretted the choice, but Elena heard the weight of sacrifice in his voice, the heavy math of love that sometimes demands everything you thought you wanted. She wanted to tell him about her own calculations, the spreadsheets of success that had somehow added up to emptiness, the corporate victories that felt increasingly hollow. Instead, she handed him another plate and said, "She's lucky to have you." Some truths were too big for dinner conversation, but they settled between them anyway, comfortable and understood. The evening ended with Emma falling asleep during a movie, curled against Elena's side like a trusting cat. Jake carried his daughter to bed while Elena stood at the window, looking out over a neighborhood where porch lights glowed like earthbound stars, and families settled into evening routines behind curtained windows. This was what she'd been missing, she realized. Not just love, but belonging. Not just success, but significance. When Jake returned, they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the night deepen over his small kingdom of honest living. "I should go," Elena said, though every part of her wanted to stay. "Will you come back?" Jake asked, and something in his voice made her turn to face him fully. Not will you come back to get your car serviced, or will you come back when you need something fixed, just will you come back? "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'd like that very much, but secrets have a way of surfacing like oil on water, impossible to contain once they begin to spread." Elena returned 3 times over the next 2 weeks, each visit feeling more natural than the last. She helped Emma with homework, learned to appreciate the simple perfection of Jake's grilled cheese sandwiches, and discovered that her expensive education had somehow failed to teach her the things that mattered most. How to build trust, one conversation at a time. How to find joy in small moments. How to be present instead of perpetually planning. She told them she worked in an office, kept her answers vague when they asked about her life, and carefully parked her car 2 blocks away, walking the rest of the distance. The deception felt justified. She was protecting something precious and fragile, this bubble of normalcy she'd never known she wanted. The bubble burst on a Tuesday evening when Emma casually mentioned seeing Elena's picture in a magazine at the grocery store. "The lady looked just like you, but her hair was different, and she was wearing a fancy dress and standing next to a really tall man in a suit." Jake's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as Emma continued with innocent enthusiasm. "The magazine said she was super rich and owned a big company. Isn't that funny? She even had the same name, Elena Martinez." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena watched as understanding dawned in Jake's eyes, followed by something that looked like betrayal. "CEO of Martinez Automotive," he said slowly, as if testing the words. "The same Martinez Automotive that canceled our engine development contract 5 years ago. The same company that laid off half our team right before Christmas." His voice was quiet, but Elena heard the devastation underneath. Not just professional disappointment, but the unraveling of trust. The conversation that followed was like watching something beautiful shatter in slow motion. Jake's questions came like arrows, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. Why was she really here? What did she want from him? From Emma? Had this all been some kind of sick game for a bored billionaire? Elena tried to explain, to make him understand that her feelings were real, that she hadn't known about the contract when she first met him, that everything between them had grown from genuine connection. But how do you convince someone that your love isn't charity when you've built it on a foundation of lies? How do you prove that your heart is honest when your words haven't been? Jake listened with the patience of a man accustomed to disappointment. His arms crossed, his eyes guarded. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I think you should leave, Elena, and I think you should stay away." 3 days of silence stretched like years. Elena sat in board meetings where million-dollar decisions were made with casual efficiency, but all she could think about was Emma's laugh and Jake's gentle hands fixing broken things. She drove past the garage twice, but couldn't bring herself to stop. What right did she have to disrupt their peace again? Her engagement ring sat on her nightstand, forgotten, while her phone buzzed with increasingly urgent messages from her family about wedding plans and business mergers. The life she'd built with such careful precision suddenly felt like a prison, constructed from her own ambitions. She found herself standing at her office window, 30 floors above the city, wondering when she'd started measuring success by how far she was from the ground, instead of how close she was to the things that mattered. The decision came when she least expected it, wrapped in crisis like a gift you never wanted but desperately needed. Emma had an accident, nothing serious, just a bicycle collision that resulted in a sprained wrist and a scared 8-year-old who wanted her father. Jake had been in the middle of a complex engine rebuild when the call came, his hands covered in grease, his phone dead, the garage landline ringing unanswered because he was deep under a car hood. Elena happened to be driving past. Not by accident, if she was honest with herself, but because she'd been making these hopeless circuits for days, when she saw the ambulance parked outside the elementary school. Something in her chest twisted with sudden panic, and she found herself running toward the crowd of parents and teachers gathered on the sidewalk. When she saw Emma sitting on the ambulance bumper, tears streaming down her face while a paramedic wrapped her wrist, Elena didn't think about boundaries or Jake's wishes or her own complicated position in their lives. She simply knelt beside the little girl and said, "Hey, sweetheart, it's going to be okay." Emma's face crumpled with relief. "Elena, where's my dad? I keep calling, but he doesn't answer, and everyone says he's coming, but he's not here, and my wrist really hurts, and I was scared you wouldn't come back because you've been gone for days and days." The words tumbled out between sobs, and Elena felt something crack open in her chest. Not breaking, but opening, like a flower that had been closed too long. She held Emma's good hand and said, "I'm here now, and your dad will be here any minute. He's probably just working on a car and can't hear his phone. You know how loud those engines can be." Jake arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing his work clothes, panic written across his face in harsh lines. He saw Elena first, their eyes meeting across the crowd, and for a moment the careful walls he'd built wavered. Then he saw Emma, safe and bandaged and tucked against Elena's side, and something in his expression shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. Elena had come when Emma needed someone. She hadn't called ahead or asked permission or made it about her own feelings. She'd simply shown up, and that meant something. After the paperwork was signed and Emma was pronounced fine except for the sprain, the three of them stood awkwardly in the school parking lot. "Thank you," Jake said finally, his voice rough, "for being here, for her." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. "I should go," she said, but Emma's good hand shot up to catch her sleeve. "Just don't go yet. Please? Dad, can Elena come home with us? Just for tonight? I don't want to be alone, and you have to work on Mr. Peterson's car, and Elena makes really good hot chocolate." The evening that followed was quieter than their previous times together, weighted with things unsaid but somehow more honest for the silence. Elena made hot chocolate while Jake finished the urgent repair in the garage. Emma curled between them on the couch, watching cartoons with her bandaged wrist propped on a pillow. They didn't talk about the past 3 days, or the lies, or the hurt feelings. Instead, they existed in the present moment, one injured little girl, one worried father, and one woman learning that love wasn't about what you could provide, but about what you were willing to stay for. When Emma finally fell asleep, Jake carried her to bed, and Elena began quietly cleaning the kitchen, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because this felt like home in a way her empty mansion never had. "We need to talk," Jake said when he returned, and Elena's heart clenched. She'd been dreading this conversation for 3 days, but she also knew it was necessary. They sat at his kitchen table, the same table where Emma did homework and they'd shared so many meals, and Elena tried to find words for feelings she'd never had to explain before. "I lied to you," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Not about everything, but about enough. I am Elena Martinez, CEO of Martinez Automotive. I am engaged to a man I don't love because it makes good business sense. I do have more money than I know what to do with, and yes, my company did cancel your contract." She paused, meeting his eyes. "But I didn't know any of that when I met you. I didn't know who you were until Emma mentioned the magazine. And everything I felt, everything we built, that was real." Jake listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, turning his coffee mug in slow circles on the worn table. "I believe you," he said finally, and Elena felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "But belief and trust aren't the same thing. You could have told me the truth after you figured it out. You could have been honest about who you are instead of letting me find out from my 8-year-old daughter." His words stung because they were fair. Elena had been protecting herself, not them. "You're right," she said simply. "I was scared. Scared you'd see me as the enemy instead of just me. Scared this would end before I figured out what it meant." She gestured around the small kitchen, encompassing not just the space, but everything it represented. "I've never had this, Jake, a real home. People who want me here not because of what I can do for them, but just because. I didn't want to lose it." "So what happens now?" Jake asked, and Elena heard the question underneath the question. What happens when the CO goes back to her real life? What happens to the fairy tale when midnight strikes? Elena had been asking herself the same thing for days, and the answer had crystallized with painful clarity as she'd sat holding Emma in that school parking lot. "I quit," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Not immediately. I have responsibilities, people depending on me. But I'm stepping down. My family will be furious. My fiancé will probably sue me for breach of contract, and I'll lose most of the fortune I never wanted anyway." She reached across the table, covering Jake's hand with hers. "But I'll have a chance at something real, something that matters. If you'll let me, Jake stared at their joined hands for a long moment. "It won't be easy," he said finally. "The press, the attention, the questions. Emma and I, we like our quiet life." Elena squeezed his hand gently. "I like your quiet life too. More than I've ever liked anything." The transformation didn't happen overnight. There were legal battles and family confrontations, headlines and photographers camping outside the garage, until Jake politely but firmly asked them to leave. Elena's family cut her off financially, which hurt less than she'd expected, and freed her more than she'd dared hope. She moved into a small apartment 6 blocks from the garage, close enough to walk to work, because Jake had offered her a job, not as CEO or board member or strategic advisor, but as someone who answered phones and learned to change oil and slowly earned the trust of customers who didn't care about her former title. She was terrible at it initially, her manicured hands clumsy with tools, her business vocabulary useless when Mrs. Henderson's car was making that funny noise again. But she learned, and more importantly, she belonged. 3 months after the night at Rusty's bar, Elena woke to the sound of Emma practicing piano in the apartment below. She'd given Jake her engagement ring the week before, not as a romantic gesture, but as a practical one. "Sell it," she'd said. "Use the money for Emma's college fund, or to expand the garage, or to take a vacation. Use it for something that mattered." He'd refused at first, but Elena had insisted. "It's not charity," she'd explained. "It's an investment. In us. In this life we're building together." The ring had bought new equipment for the garage and a better piano for Emma, with enough left over for the family vacation to the coast that Emma had been planning with the serious dedication of a military strategist. The morning routine had become sacred in its simplicity. Elena would make coffee while Jake started breakfast, Emma would complain good-naturedly about having to brush her teeth, and they would all pile into Jake's pickup truck for the school run before heading to the garage together. Elena had learned to read Jake's moods in the set of his shoulders, to understand Emma's needs in the space between her words, to find joy in the mechanical problems that brought broken cars and worried owners to their small corner of the world. She'd discovered that fixing things, really fixing them, not just managing them, required patience and precision, and a kind of love she'd never learned in business school. On a Tuesday evening in late spring, as Elena helped Emma with a science project about renewable energy while Jake worked late on a particularly stubborn transmission, she realized that happiness had crept up on her like dusk. So gradually she hadn't noticed, until she was completely surrounded by it. They weren't perfect. No real family was. Jake still sometimes withdrew when the weight of single parenthood felt too heavy. Emma occasionally tested boundaries with the determination of someone who'd learned early that love could disappear without warning, and Elena struggled with the urge to solve problems with money instead of presence. But they were real, and they were theirs, and that was enough. The call came on a Friday evening while they were making dinner together. Elena reading instructions from a cookbook Jake's wife had marked with notes in the margins. Jake translating those notes into actual cooking techniques. Emma setting the table with elaborate care. Elena's lawyer was brief and efficient. The divorce proceedings were final, the business transfer complete, and she was officially free from the life she'd built but never wanted. When she hung up, Jake and Emma were both watching her, with careful expressions, reading her face for signs of regret or loss. Instead, Elena smiled. Not the polished smile she'd perfected for board meetings, but the crooked, genuine one she'd learned in this kitchen. "Well," she said, hanging up her apron, "I guess I'm officially unemployed." Emma giggled. "Dad, can we give Elena a raise?" Jake laughed, pulling both his girls into a hug that smelled like motor oil and vanilla extract, and home. "I think we can manage something." Later that night, after Emma was asleep and the dishes were done, Elena and Jake sat on the small balcony outside his apartment, sharing a beer and watching traffic lights change in the distance. The conversation came easily now, filled with comfortable silences and the kind of honesty that grows from shared daily life, rather than grand romantic gestures. "Do you miss it?" Jake asked, and Elena knew he meant the power, the money, the importance she'd walked away from. She considered the question seriously, running her fingers along the condensation on her beer bottle. "I miss some of it," she admitted. "The feeling of making decisions that mattered, of solving big problems, but I've learned that big doesn't always mean important." She gestured toward the window where Emma's drawings covered the refrigerator, where Jake's engineering textbooks sat beside children's novels, where their 3 coffee mugs waited in the dish drainer for tomorrow morning. This matters, what we're building here. It's small, but it's real. The summer brought new rhythms and deeper roots. Elena learned to braid Emma's hair for swim lessons. Jake taught her to change brake pads without breaking anything important. And Emma appointed herself the family's social coordinator, arranging playdates and picnics with the elaborate planning skills she'd inherited from both parents. The garage thrived with Elena's customer service skills and Jake's mechanical expertise, but more than that, it became a gathering place for their small community. Elderly customers who lingered to chat about grandchildren, young mothers who appreciated the honest service and child-friendly waiting area, teenagers who brought their first cars for patient explanations of proper maintenance. One evening in late August, as they were closing the garage after a particularly busy day, Emma made an announcement that stopped both adults in their tracks. "I think we should get married," she said with the matter-of-fact tone she used for important decisions. "Not like a big fancy wedding with flowers and stuff, but just the 3 of us. Because we're already a family, we just haven't made it official." Elena and Jake exchanged glances over Emma's head, both trying not to laugh at the 8-year-old's assumption that marriage was a practical decision rather than a romantic one. But as Elena thought about it, she realized Emma was right. They were already a family, bound together not by law or ceremony, but by choice, by daily kindness, by the decision to stay even when staying was hard. The proposal, when it finally came, was as quiet and practical as everything else about their relationship. Jake asked Elena to marry him on a Tuesday morning while they were both covered in engine grease, having spent the previous hour trying to diagnose a mysterious noise in Mrs. Patterson's sedan. "I don't have a ring yet," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "And I know this isn't exactly romantic, but—" Elena silenced him with a kiss that tasted like coffee and possibility. "Yes," she said against his mouth. "Yes, and yes, and yes." When they told Emma that evening, she responded with the world-weary satisfaction of someone whose advice had finally been taken. "Good," she said, returning to her homework. "Can we get a dog now?" The wedding was everything Elena's previous engagement had not been. Small, honest, and focused on the people who mattered, rather than the people who ought to matter. Emma served as both flower girl and ring bearer, distributing rose petals with scientific precision and delivering the rings with a speech about the chemical properties of gold that had everyone laughing and crying simultaneously. Jake's best man was his elderly neighbor who'd helped with Emma during the worst days after his wife's death, and Elena's maid of honor was the teacher who'd been in the school parking lot the day Emma was hurt, who'd become an unexpected friend and surrogate grandmother. The ceremony took place in the garage, among the tools and machinery that had brought them together, with Emma's piano music providing the soundtrack and the community they'd built serving as witnesses. As autumn settled over their small corner of the world, Elena found herself pregnant, a surprise that brought equal measures of joy and terror to all 3 of them. Emma approached impending big sisterhood with characteristic seriousness, reading books about infant development and making lists of necessary supplies with the dedication of a project manager. Jake hovered between excitement and protectiveness, remembering too clearly the fear and loss that had marked Emma's early years. Elena, meanwhile, discovered that her body was quite capable of creating life, even when her mind was focused on changing oil and answering phones, and that pregnancy cravings for grilled cheese sandwiches could be very conveniently satisfied by the household expert. The baby arrived on a snowy February morning, making his entrance with the kind of dramatic timing that suggested he'd inherited his mother's flair for the theatrical and his father's precision with deadlines. Emma was the first to hold her baby brother, her face solemn with the weight of responsibility as she counted his fingers and toes with scientific thoroughness before declaring him acceptable for family membership. Jake cried when he held his son for the first time. Not the bitter tears of loss he'd shed 8 years earlier, but the overwhelming joy of a man who'd learned that love multiplies rather than divides. that hearts expand to hold whatever they're asked to carry. They named him David, after Jake's father, but Emma immediately started calling him Squeaky due to the small sounds he made while sleeping, and the nickname stuck with the stubborn persistence of family tradition. And Elena, holding her son while Emma read him a book about dolphins and Jake puttered around the kitchen making soup, realized that this was what success actually looked like. Not the corner office or the magazine covers, but this warm chaos of people who chose each other daily, who built something beautiful from the ordinary materials of patience and presence and love. 2 years later, Elena stood in the same garage where she'd first discovered that broken things could be made whole again, watching Jake teach Emma how to change spark plugs while David napped in his carrier, surrounded by the familiar sounds of honest work and family conversation. Her life bore no resemblance to the one she'd planned, and it was infinitely better for the deviation. She'd learned that happiness wasn't something you achieved, but something you practiced, not a destination, but a way of traveling. The garage had expanded, the family had grown, and the community around them had deepened, but the essential truth remained the same. Love was built in moments, sustained by choice, and measured not in what you accumulated, but in what you gave away. The evening routine had evolved to accommodate their expanding family. Elena reading bedtime stories while Jake finished the day's work. Emma practicing piano while David gurgled appreciation from his bouncy seat. All of them eventually gathering on the couch for the quiet conversations that tied their days together. As Elena tucked Emma into bed, the 8-year-old, now a sophisticated 10 with strong opinions about everything from environmental policy to proper brake fluid, she reflected on the distance between the woman who'd sat alone in Rusty's bar and the mother who now kissed goodnight, the child who'd taught her that love was a verb, requiring daily practice. Later, as she and Jake sat on their small balcony with David sleeping between them, Elena realized that she'd found what she'd been searching for in that smoky bar 2.5 years earlier. Not just love, but belonging. Not just success, but significance. Not just someone to fill the empty spaces, but people who helped her understand that the spaces hadn't been empty at all, just waiting for the right kind of fullness. Jake reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice, and Elena knew that this was how happiness actually worked. Not as a lightning strike or a lottery ticket, but as a garden that grew slowly, tended by ordinary gestures and watered by the decision to stay, even when staying required everything you thought you were and demanded you become someone better. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest choices. Elena had chosen to speak to a stranger in a bar, to accept an invitation to dinner, to stay when leaving would have been easier. She'd chosen to tell the truth when lies would have been safer, to build something real when everything artificial would have been more comfortable. Most importantly, she'd chosen to stay, not just in their house or their town, but in the daily work of becoming a family, of learning that love wasn't a feeling you fell into, but a commitment you climbed toward, one ordinary day at a time. As she watched Jake's sleeping face in the dim light and listened to David's quiet breathing, Elena understood finally that the best things in life weren't the ones you planned for, but the ones you were brave enough to reach for when they appeared, unexpected and perfect, in the space between one heartbeat and the next.